On a cold morning in March of 1911, 12 black men were marched into a forest in central Maryland. They were handed shovels, pickaxes, and wheelbarrows. Under the watch of a doctor named Winterrode, they were ordered to clear the trees, flatten the earth, and begin pouring concrete. For months, these men hauled bricks, mixed mortar, and pushed barrows of wet cement up wooden ramps 3.5 stories high. They built walls, they laid floors, they framed windows with iron grates, and when the last brick was set and the last door was hung, those 12 men were marched inside. The building they had just constructed with their own hands became their prison. They were the first patients of a place the state of Maryland called the Hospital for the Negro Insane. This is the story of Crownsville. And what happened inside its walls over the next 93 years is one of the darkest chapters in the history of American institutions. The hospital existed because of a simple and brutal reality. In the early 1900s, Maryland had no facility for black citizens suffering from mental illness. Hundreds of African Americans were locked in county jails and poorhouses across the state, chained in dark cells, sleeping on straw. Many had committed no crime. Their only offense was being black and unwell in a country that treated those two things as the same problem. Doctors at the time openly argued that black people were incapable of handling freedom. They claimed the rise in mental illness among African Americans after emancipation proved that slavery had been a stabilizing force. That was the ideology that built Crownsville. A report from the Maryland State Lunacy Commission in 1908 admitted the conditions were a source of shame and humiliation, but the solution was not equality. The solution was segregation. The state legislature passed an act in 1910 creating a separate hospital exclusively for black patients. The law came with two specific requirements. The hospital must include a working farm, and it must not be built anywhere near Baltimore. The state purchased 556 acres of old tobacco and willow farmland near Annapolis for $19,000. They put the patients to work building it. Those first 12 men lived in a willow curing house beside a pond. They harvested tobacco and willow crops by day and slept in what was essentially a labor camp by night. Within months, more patients arrived. Smallpox broke out, then scarlet fever. The water supply was contaminated, and tuberculosis became a constant killer. In the hospital's first few years, nearly 40% of admitted patients died. Almost a third of those deaths came from tuberculosis alone. There was no isolation ward for them. Black patients with tuberculosis at Crownsville were simply left among the general population to infect others. When the state finally built a special tuberculosis treatment facility, it was placed at the all-white Springfield Hospital. Crownsville's patients were excluded, but the horror of Crownsville was not limited to disease. It was designed into the system itself. Among the thousands who would pass through these walls, one patient's story would eventually connect Crownsville to one of the most celebrated breakthroughs in the history of modern medicine. By the 1940s, the hospital had become a dumping ground. It was the only mental health facility in the entire state of Maryland that accepted African Americans. That single fact turned Crownsville into something no institution was ever designed to be. The criminally insane were housed alongside children with epilepsy. People with alcoholism shared wards with patients suffering from severe psychosis. Teenagers with syphilis slept next to elderly patients with dementia. Adults, children, the violent, the helpless, all crammed together on one campus with almost no staff to manage them. People could be committed to Crownsville for almost anything: for refusing to give up their seat to a white person, for being a black man with a foreign accent who got lost in the wrong part of the city, for being homeless, for being inconvenient. A confidential report in 1944 revealed that Crownsville was 30% over capacity, while the two large white hospitals were only about 11% over. The death rate per 1,000 patients at Crownsville was 102. At the white hospitals, it was 59 and 60, nearly double, same state, same system, a different color of skin. An inspector who visited the boys' ward that same year described what he found. 27 boys sitting at dinner completely naked, most of them spilling food on themselves, a single attendant watching over all of them. On another occasion, patients in the ward for the intellectually disabled were found with no clothing at all. Not because clothes were being washed, because there were no clothes to give them. And here is the detail that should unsettle anyone paying attention. For the first several decades of Crownsville's existence, every single patient was black, and every single employee was white. The people responsible for the care of these patients did not look like them, did not live among them, and in many documented cases, did not see them as fully human. Generations of workers would later describe a smell that never left them, a stench that came from the buildings themselves. It soaked into clothing, into hair, into skin. Former employees said they could never fully wash it away. It was the smell of neglect concentrated over decades, baked into the walls and the floors and the air itself. In 1948, the Baltimore Sun published a devastating series of articles under the title, Maryland's Shame. The reporting described more than 1,800 men, women, and children crammed into buildings designed to hold 1,100. The articles generated outrage across the state. But conditions barely changed. By 1955, the population had swelled to 2,719 patients in a facility meant for half that number. And it was during this period of extreme overcrowding that something far worse was happening behind closed doors. Crownsville had become a laboratory. Doctors at the hospital subjected patients to experiments without their knowledge or consent. In the 1930s, insulin shock therapy was introduced. Patients were injected with massive doses of insulin, sending them into convulsions and comas. In 1942, a malaria treatment program began in which patients were deliberately infected with malaria parasites. As many as 20 patients at a time were inoculated with the disease. By 1948, the hospital's annual report documented that over 100 patients received shock treatments, 56 were given malaria and penicillin treatments, and 33 underwent lobotomies in a single year. But one procedure stands out for its sheer brutality. It was called pneumoencephalography. Doctors drilled holes into the skulls of patients, drained the cerebrospinal fluid that naturally surrounds and protects the brain, and pumped air or helium into the empty space. The patients were then strapped to a chair, flipped upside down, and X-rayed from multiple angles. The purpose was to get clearer images of the brain. The side effects were devastating: crippling headaches, seizures, violent vomiting, disorientation that lasted for months until the body slowly refilled the skull with fluid. There is no evidence that consent was ever obtained from the patients or from their families. The rationale was chilling in its simplicity. These patients were never going back to the community. They had nothing to lose, and they could pay back the institution for the cost of their stay. And among the patients subjected to these experiments was a girl who would connect Crownsville to one of the most important stories in the history of modern science. Her name was Elsie Lax. She was the daughter of a woman named Henrietta Lax, whose story has since reshaped how the world thinks about medical ethics. In 1951, doctors at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore took a sample of cancer cells from Henrietta without her knowledge. Those cells, labeled HeLa, became the first human cells to survive and reproduce indefinitely in a laboratory. They have been used in virtually every major medical breakthrough since: the polio vaccine, cancer research, gene mapping, COVID treatments. Billions of dollars in medical advancement built on cells taken from one black woman without her consent. Henrietta Lax never received a cent, neither did her family. But what most people do not know is what happened to her daughter. Elsie had epilepsy. Her family described her as different. Some believed she was deaf. Around 1950, When Henrietta became pregnant with her 5th child, caring for Elsie became impossible. Doctors recommended sending the girl to Crownsville. She was 11 years old. Henrietta visited her daughter at the hospital every week without fail. She was the last person to visit Elsie before dying of cervical cancer in October of 1951, the same illness that produced the cells that changed medicine forever. After Henrietta's death, no one visited Elsie again. She was alone inside those walls for 4 years. Elsie died at Crownsville in 1955. She was 15 years old. Decades later, when her sister Deborah went searching for answers about what had happened to Elsie, she found an autopsy photograph in the hospital's records. In the image, Elsie's eyes are wide. She appears to be crying out. Her head is being held in place against a wall by a white staff member. Based on the experiments being conducted at Crownsville during the years Elsie was a patient, researchers believe it is almost certain she was one of the children who had holes drilled into her skull. The medical establishment took Henrietta Lacks's cells without permission and built an empire of knowledge on them. And it locked her daughter inside a crumbling asylum where children were used as test subjects. That is the full picture of what American medicine did to one family. But Crownsville was not only a story of cruelty, it was also, eventually, a story of people who tried to change it from the inside. In the late 1940s, a man named Jacob Morgenstern became superintendent. He was a Jewish immigrant from Austria and a Holocaust survivor. When he arrived at Crownsville and saw the conditions, he recognized something familiar. He had just escaped one system of state-sanctioned brutality, and now he was standing inside another. Morgenstern opposed lobotomies openly. By 1954, he had stopped them entirely at Crownsville. He quietly reached out to the local NAACP chapter and began the slow and dangerous process of integrating the hospital staff years before the rest of the state was ready. In 1943, Vernon Sparks had become the first licensed black psychologist in the state of Maryland and the first black employee at Crownsville. He and the black women who followed him in the 1950s and 60s witnessed things that no white staff member had apparently noticed in 4 decades. Patients without clothes, men whose pants fell down because no one had thought to provide belts. These new employees went home after their shifts, gathered their own clothing, and brought it to the hospital the next day. They fashioned makeshift belts from whatever materials they could find. Simple acts of dignity that for 40 years nobody else had bothered to perform. Paul Lurs arrived at Crownsville in 1964 as a young social work student. He stayed for 40 years until the hospital closed. He became the institution's unofficial historian, rescuing records from dumpsters and basements, preserving photographs and documents that administrators wanted destroyed. He described Crownsville in a single sentence that has come to define it. You were more likely to leave Crownsville through death than through discharge. In 1929 alone, the hospital recorded 55 discharges and 92 deaths. The farming operation shut down in the 1960s. What followed was revealing. A mass release of patients came almost immediately afterward. The timing made the truth impossible to ignore. Many of those patients had been kept, not because they needed treatment, but because the hospital needed their labor. Once the farm closed, their usefulness ended and they were set free. Conditions improved significantly in the years after integration. Art therapy was introduced and dance classes began. Patients painted murals across the walls and window panes of the hospital buildings. Bright colors, faces, trees, landscapes. Expression came from people who had been treated as though they had nothing worth expressing. Some of those murals still survive today inside the abandoned structures, untouched for decades. By the end of the 20th century, the population had dwindled to almost nothing. Outpatient care had improved. Public attitudes toward institutionalization were shifting. In July of 2004, Crownsville Hospital Center closed its doors for good. The last 200 patients were transferred elsewhere. The closure saved the state of Maryland $12 million a year. The buildings were left to decay, but the land held one final secret. Tucked away on a remote section of the 544-acre campus sat a cemetery that most people who worked at the hospital never even knew existed. Rows and rows of small stone markers lying flat against the ground. No names, no dates, no flowers, just numbers. Between 1912 and 1965, more than 1,700 patients from 26 states and 4 countries were buried in this cemetery. The vast majority were identified only by a number etched into stone. Families either could not afford a proper burial or had long ago abandoned their loved ones to the stigma of mental illness. When patients died at Crownsville, other patients built their coffins and carried the bodies to the cemetery themselves. Some of the graves may not even contain whole remains. The hospital performed its own autopsies and experiments, and body parts were sometimes buried separately. Other unclaimed remains were shipped to the University of Maryland Medical School for further research. For decades, the cemetery was forgotten, overgrown with weeds and brush, invisible to the outside world. Then, in 2001, an Annapolis historian named Janice Hayes Williams visited the grounds for the first time. She had come because someone at the hospital was looking for her uncle, a man known in the community for restoring neglected cemeteries. They walked the grounds together that spring morning. What they found stopped them both in their tracks. Hayes Williams later recalled the moment. "Never before in our lives had we seen a cemetery with no names," he cried. A grown man brought to tears by the realization that a cemetery, a place where you go to find out your legacy, had nothing there but numbers. She made a promise on the spot. She would find out who was buried beneath those stones. Over the next 2 decades, Hayes Williams and a team of volunteers searched through thousands of death certificates at the Maryland State Archives. They cross-referenced records, matched burial notations to patient files, and slowly, name by name, rebuilt the identities of the forgotten dead. It took 20 years. Nearly 1,600 names were recovered. In 2005, Hayes Williams organized the first Say My Name ceremony at the cemetery. A small group gathered to sing, to pray, and to scatter rose petals across the numbered stones. And for the first time in nearly a century, they spoke the names of the dead out loud, giving them back the identities the institution had stripped away. That ceremony has been held every year since. What started with a handful of visitors grew to more than 200. In September of 2025, a permanent memorial was unveiled at the site. 16 tons of black granite were inscribed with every recovered name, their birth year, and the state they came from. The cost was funded by the state and county. The work was made possible by one woman who refused to let 1,700 people remain anonymous. Hayes Williams described the moment simply. It is the beginning of reconciliation and healing. Small acts of atonement are a sign of acceptance of the past mistakes and commitments to assure that it will never happen again. Today, the abandoned campus of Crownsville State Hospital sits barely a mile from the Anne Arundel County Fairgrounds and the grounds of the Maryland Renaissance Festival. Every autumn, thousands of people drive right past without knowing what lies just beyond the tree line. The buildings are crumbling. The iron window grates that once kept patients locked inside now keep trespassers out. But behind those grates, the murals painted by patients during art therapy still cover the walls. Color and life left behind by people the system tried to erase. Anne Arundel County acquired the property in 2022. A master plan was released in early 2025 to transform the grounds into a memorial park dedicated to healing, reflection, and community. The state legislature has committed $30 million to the effort. The patients who built Crownsville with their bare hands in 1911 could never have imagined that one day the land they were forced to clear would become a place designed to honor their suffering. That the numbers etched into their gravestones would be replaced with names. That a story the state of Maryland tried to bury for almost a century would eventually be told out loud. But it took nearly 100 years for anyone to tell it, and it should never have taken that long.